we are ready to start talking about the second half of the B deduction. And that would seem to be a great place to ask the question, why on earth is there a second half of the B deduction? After all, paragraph 20 proves all sensible intuitions stand under the categories as conditions under which alone their manifold can come together in one consciousness. Alright, so all sensible intuitions fall under the categories. Well, wasn't that precisely what the transcendental deduction had set out to prove? And if that was what the transcendental deduction had set out to prove, why doesn't Kant stop here? Right? Why isn't this the end of the transcendental deduction? Why are there 7 more paragraphs, including some of the most complicated parts, really, of the critique? Why do they exist? What is still left to do? This is one of the, I would say, most hotly debated questions in Kant scholarship. It's something that Kant scholars absolutely do not agree about, and about which they have radically different theories. I'm not going to try and give an overview of all the possible theories you could have. I think that for our approach to the critique of pure reason, it would be good enough if we have one plausible story about what Kant is going to do in the second half of the B deduction. And I'm going to try to give you that story using a fantastically good article, which I happen to think is, mostly right, by James Conant. So this video is going to be about the James Conant article, and it's going to give, I hope, to you a bit of an overview of the different kinds of decisions, interpretative decisions, that you would have to make about the B deduction and its relation to the rest of the critique. And also give you a pretty good idea, at least one pretty good idea, of what is going to happen in the second half of the B deduction and what its relation to the first half of the B deduction is. So let's get started. This article by James Conant is called Kant's Critique of the Layer Cake Conception of Human Mindedness in the B deduction. That's a mouthful, let me say it again. Kant's Critique of the layer cake conception of human mindedness in the B deduction. So in the B deduction, Kant is criticizing something, and what he is criticizing is a particular conception of human mindedness, of how the human mind works, namely a layer cake conception. I'm going to explain what that means in a moment. I get this article from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, a critical guide, edited by James O'Shea. But I think it's available in other venues as well. Okay, what is the layer cake conception? Well, here is one of the important questions that we would have to ask about the critique of pure reason anyway. It's what is the relation between the aesthetic on the one hand and the analytic on the other hand? So in the aesthetic, we were looking merely at the forms of intuition, right? We were looking merely at the sensible conditions of knowledge. And then in the analytic, we are going to look at the intellectual conditions of knowledge. Now, there seem to be 2 options here, right? Very roughly speaking, 2 options. One option is that these are 2 layers of human mindedness, right? So first, what happens in the human mind is that we get this purely sensible awareness of things. And then second, we apply the categories to the sensations that are given to us in sensibility, right? So that's a sort of 2 layers or 2 steps, or at least two moments, to use a kind of Hegelian term, in getting the kind of awareness of the world that we have. That way of thinking is what Conant calls the layer cake conception of human mindedness. And so the layer cake conception of human mindedness would be associated with the idea that the aesthetic and the analytic talk about 2 different layers, or 2 different stages of human cognition. First, pure sensibility, and then the understanding applied to whatever happens in sensibility. The second way of thinking about the relation between the aesthetic and the analytic is that, okay, when Kant writes the aesthetic, he is talking merely in terms of sensibility, but that means that he can't really tell the whole story, because we can't really understand what is going on in the aesthetic until we also have the analytic, because actually the intellectual conditions of human knowledge and the sensible conditions of human knowledge can't really be pried apart. They're sort of part of one indissoluble whole, which does not consist of two layers. And so, in a sense, what the analytic will have to do, it will have to give us a renewed, better understanding of what happened in the aesthetic. That is the view that Conant is going to argue for in his article, and it is that view that, according to Conant, is the key to understanding why the B deduction has these two parts. And the basic idea here is that the first half of the B deduction, in a sense it proves what we needed to prove. It proves that the categories will apply to sensible intuition, but it leaves open the layer cake conception. It leaves open the idea that there is first something that appears to us in sensation, and then we apply the categories to it. But if that is what happens, Conant tells us, if that is what happens, then there seems to be a pretty clear sense in which the categories do not have objective validity. Because, the objects, in a sense, really appear in sensibility, and then we sort of modify them or change them or add the categories to them. But of course, what ends up as the result of that is not going to be the same thing that was there in sensibility in the first place. And so the intuition, right, it sort of gets distorted or changed in some weird way by the application of the categories. That at least would be the worry. And so, the story that we have just described in the first half of the B deduction might be the story of how human beings always have to think about sensible objects in terms of categories, but it wouldn't really show that the categories apply to the sensible objects as they are given in sensible intuition. And so, as long as the layer cake conception of human-mindedness is on the table, kind of a festive image actually, as long as that's on the table, we have to worry. We have to worry that the categories merely distort whatever is given to us in sensibility, and therefore don't really have objective validity. We might not help thinking about sensible objects in terms of categories, but that's not really the result that we wanted to get to. We wanted the result that the categories were objectively valid for the objects that are given to us in sensible intuition. And so what the second half of the B deduction would have to do is it would have to show to us that we should get rid of the layer cake conception, that actually the way that objects are given to us in sensibility is always already thoroughly contaminated, well, that's the word that we want to avoid, always already involves the categories. Right? The idea that something could first be given in sensibility and then the categories are applied to it must be wrong. That's what the second half of the B deduction has to show us. It must be wrong. The categories are always already at work in any object being given in intuition. Okay, let's see how that works a little bit more by looking at the way that James Conant sets up this debate. And so in the first section of his debate, what he does, well actually this is in the second section of his debate, his article, what he does is he presents 4 what he calls choice points in the reading of the first critique. So he's going to give us 4 sort of choices, like you can read it like this or you can read it like that. And so there's a first option and a second option. And in all cases, the first option sort of works well together with the other first options. So all the first options go together and all the second options go together. And the first options go together with the layer cake conception. And the second options go together with rejecting the layer cake conception. And I think I do want to talk about those 4 choice points a little bit, because they will clarify to us the kinds of questions and the kinds of interpretative dilemmas that are at stake here, and a way of thinking that might lead you to either embrace the layer cake conception or reject the layer cake conception. And then in the later half of the article, Conant is going to tell us how rejecting the layer cake conception helps us understand the structure of the B deduction, and that's basically what I've been telling you up until now. Okay, so here are the 4 choice points. The first choice point that Conant defines is this: restrictive versus non-restrictive conceptions of subjectivity. So here's the way that that we could set this up. It is clear, let me just read out a little bit of Conant. It is clear that Kant's aim in the first critique is to elucidate the concept of finite knowledge. Right? We are finite knowers. But much depends on how the concept of finitude or limitation is elaborated here. There is a tendency to elaborate it in what I will call restrictive terms, in accordance with the conception according to which the finite knower is pictured as if he were sealed into a delimited sphere. According to this picture, there is an area within which our reason operates, but the price of our being able to enjoy its satisfactory operation within that domain is that we must pay the price of running up against a limit the other side of which we can dimly make out, although we cannot have knowledge of what goes on there. So, on a restrictive reading, what we can get from the critique is we can get, knowledge. We finite knowers can get knowledge about some things, but there's also clearly an area outside of the bounds of our knowledge, which we can, grasp and understand. That we can grasp and understand that it's there, but to which our knowledge does not have access. So, what happens in the first critique is that a dimension of subjectivity is added into the story, right? A dimension of subjectivity. There's certain elements like space and time, like the categories, that come from the structure of us, the subject. On the restrictive conception, Conant writes, the dimension of subjectivity hereby introduced into an account of knowledge restricts or otherwise compromises the character of the objectivity to which such a form of knowledge can lay claim, whereas on a non-restrictive conception, the relevant dimension of subjectivity that thereby comes into view is properly understood only once it has been appreciated that it is nothing other than a condition on the possibility of the only conception of objectivity we are coherently able to think through and make sense of. So, the distinction is this, right? On one reading, subjectivity, like the kind of subjectivity that the critique points out to us when it talks about, like space and time and the categories and so on, ensures that the knowledge that we have is not fully objective. So that's one reading. The other reading says, no, the whole point of Kant is that these structures of subjectivity form precisely the elements of the only conception of objectivity that we have, right? For something to be objective knowledge is for it to be, synthesized in a certain way, brought into unity in a certain way, in accordance with these forms of subjectivity, right? And we do not have another conception of objectivity that sort of lies beyond that. Now, what is the relevance of this to the layer cake conception of human mindedness? The relevance is, says Conant, that if you believe in the first of these two options, that some kind of objectivity gets lost when we apply these subjective conditions of knowledge that we find in ourselves, the picture that goes with that is that our subjective conception, that our subjective, these subjective elements, these subjective conditions are imposed upon some kind of object that is already there, irrespective of our subjective conditions. So when it comes to the categories, which are the subjective intellectual conditions of knowledge, if you believe that our final categorical knowledge is not really objective, that sort of goes together with the idea that the categories are imposed on something that is not itself categorical. So there is an object that is not categorical and which appears to us in sensibility, and then we take the categories and we sort of impose them on the object, thereby changing it, deforming it, and turning it into something that is not fully objective anymore. Okay, so that's how this first choice point is related to the layer cake conception. Second choice point, a two-stage versus anti-two-stage reading of the relation between the aesthetic and the analytic. Now, this is basically what I have already been talking about at the beginning of this video, right? On a two-stage reading, there is something that, the aesthetic gives us a story, full and complete, about the way that things appear to us in sensibility. And then the analytic adds to that a story of how the understanding gets to be applied to whatever happened in the aesthetic, right? Whatever, we found in sensibility. An anti-two-stage reading of the critique would say, no, whatever, the analytic is talking about, these categories, is actually, in a sense, a precisification, or is generating greater insight into what we were talking about in the aesthetic. So the aesthetic is not a full and complete story. And, many of the things that the aesthetic talks about, like an appearance or space and time, we can only really understand what those are once we have the analytic in place as well. Because there's no two stages. The, workings of sensibility and the workings of the understanding are, they can't be pried apart. We couldn't even conceive of sensibility, of objects appearing in sensibility without the understanding already, like fundamentally from the very beginning, being at work there. And so this very obviously, I would say, relates to this layer cake conception. A third choice point, very closely connected to the previous one. Are there two senses of the term intuition and related terms, like I would say appearance and probably even space and time? The reason to believe that there are is, well, if you think that in the aesthetic, Kant was talking about, something that is merely sensible and has absolutely no categorical structure because the categories haven't been introduced yet, then you're going to find that a lot of things that he talks about, like intuition and experience and stuff like that, later on in the book, once the categories and the intellectual conditions in general have been introduced, he's still talking about those terms, and they clearly involve the intellectual conditions of knowledge. So if he is talking in those terms here, and they don't involve intellectual conditions, and if he's talking about them there and they do involve intellectual conditions, then he needs to be talking about them in two different senses. And so there is a tendency among those who accept the layer cake picture of human-mindedness to say that Kant changes the meaning of his terms, sometimes even, almost within one sentence maybe. Sometimes talking about things merely from the point of view of sensibility, and sometimes taking a broader usage that also includes intellectual conditions. So that would be that there are two senses, and of course the opposite interpretative choice is to say, no, it's all the same sense. What happens is that the definitions that Kant gives in the aesthetic are defective. They're incomplete. And they have to be defective and incomplete because they can only become fully complete and clear once we are in the analytic, once we have introduced all this stuff that we really need to, understand what we were even talking about in the aesthetic. And Conant cites a very nice passage of Kant from the very end of the book, really, from the Doctrine of Method, in which Kant is talking about the difference between philosophy and mathematics. And Kant says, in mathematics, we start out with definitions, but in philosophy, you can really only end with definitions. It's only at the end of your inquiry that you know what you were talking about. And so that, of course, really fits Conant's story, that maybe something like experience or something like appearance or intuition, all these things, we talk about them already in the aesthetic, and Kant kind of defines them. in ways that fit in the aesthetic before the intellect has been brought in. But later on we find out that actually we couldn't really define them without bringing in the intellectual conditions, and so the definitions in the aesthetic were merely preliminary. They were defective, and again, the aesthetic is not a full and complete story. Fourth choice point, the relation between subjective and objective unity of consciousness. So here is one way of thinking about Kant. That will be, once again, sort of the first option. It is to think that, Hume and Kant sort of agree about the cogency of having a purely sensible kind of experience. Right? So if you think about Hume, sort of, he starts out with, you merely have these sort of sensible things popping up in your consciousness, these elements of sensibility, and then concepts are somehow constructed out of them, right? I mean, that is a later stage. That is, something that the mind does. But at the beginning, and certainly, at our first level of theorizing about things, it ought to make total sense to think of somebody who has a merely sensible intuition, where the intellectual conditions on human knowledge do not yet take place. They don't play a role. They're not really operating or doing anything. And so on the first way of reading this thing, Kant agrees with that, right? Kant agrees with Hume that it makes sense to think about somebody having a merely sort of sensible kind of intuition. And then where Kant differs from Hume is that Kant, of course, says, well, actually, we can also know a priori that it will be possible to apply the intellectual conditions of knowledge, to apply the categories on this purely sensible, sensation stuff that is there in the first place. And of course, Hume thinks that this is not, in a sense, really possible. It doesn't really work. There's all kinds of skeptical conclusions that we would have to draw, and so on and so forth. So that's the first reading. On the second reading, Kant does not believe that this purely subjective, purely empiricist kind of consciousness is possible. Right? What the deduction is supposed to show, according to the second reading, is not that, okay, we might have this purely sensible kind of experience, but we human beings are fortunately in the situation where we can always manage to apply also these intellectual conditions of knowledge. Conant calls this somewhat amusingly the few reading of the text. It turns on the idea that it makes sense to suppose that we might have been screwed and left with a mere blooming, buzzing confusion of sensory appearances. But Kant succeeds in showing that, few, this turns out not to be the case. The second reading, the one that Conant wants us to embrace, says, no, what Kant shows in the deduction is that this first sort of purely empiricist, purely this state of pure sensory appearances with the intellect playing no role at all, that doesn't make sense. It's not just something that doesn't happen. It's not just that we find out that although things might have been a confusion, it turns out that they are not just a confusion, and we can talk about substance and causation and all that kind of stuff. It's not even that although it is thinkable, sort of conceivable that things would have been a confusion, we find out that sort of necessarily we are in the lucky position that we can, apply intellectual conditions to that merely sensible manifold. It is that the idea of a merely sensible manifold doesn't make any sense at all. Right? So according to Conant, according to the second reading, what the B deduction has to show is that the Humean empiricist scenario really doesn't make any sense at all. If we really think through what would be involved in having a purely sensible, non-intellectual kind of experience, we find out that this is self-contradictory. We find out that the intellectual conditions of knowledge are necessary to make sensibility itself possible. Okay, so if Conant is right, if we should take the second option in all of these debates, you know, in all of these interpretative debates, what we want to say is this. What we want to say is that, first of all, our very conception of objectivity involves all the subjective conditions of knowledge. And so there is no sense in which objects are given to us that is independent from any of the subjective conditions of knowledge that Kant identifies. So that would include not just intuition, but also the categories. Our very idea of any object appearing to us, including an object appearing to us in intuition, involves, once we think it through like really well, as Kant is doing here in the deduction, involves the intellectual conditions on human knowledge. Second, we have to say that the aesthetic is in a sense a merely preliminary discussion of intuition and appearance and space and time and so on, because in fact what we find out about in the analytic, the intellectual conditions of knowledge, are always already at work even in sensibility. And this means, number three, that Kant is not operating with two different conceptions of an intuition, which sort of changes at some point in the text. No, he is operating with a sort of preliminary definitions in the aesthetic, which are known to be merely preliminary and not really like the right way of talking about anything, because it's now in the analytic, it's now in the deduction that we sort of finally realize what was going on in the aesthetic, what the right way of talking about it is. And then finally, on this fourth point, what we want to say is that there is no such thing as merely sensible appearance, right? It's not the case that we have, before applying the categories, already something in which objects could be given to us, though in a merely sensible way. Objects being given to us in intuition and the application of the categories are two sides of the same coin. They really cannot be pried apart. There's no two stages there. There's no two layers there. Okay, so that is Conant's claim, and again, the way that Conant's reading, the way that Conant's claim is supposed to relate to the B deduction is that what we are supposed to find out is that the first half of the B deduction, kind of shows that we can apply the categories to any objects, or that we do apply the categories to any objects. But it doesn't yet show this fundamental connectedness of objects given in sensibility on the one hand, and objects thought under the categories on the other hand. The worry that we might have is that we have defined objects twice, right? We have defined objects as that which appears in a sensible intuition, and we have defined objects as that which is, that which falls under the categories, which is what the first half of the B deduction has been talking about. And the worry is that these might not be the same concepts, right? That the objects that appear to us in intuition are not really the same as the objects that we think through the categories. And so the burden of the second half of the B deduction is to show that that worry is misguided, that there is nothing to be worried about, because for an object to appear in intuition and for an object to fall under the categories really are the same thing. Okay, let's see how Kant does that. And let me say, as a word of warning, that paragraphs 21 to 27 are pretty labyrinthine. I do think that they bear out, especially when we come to the sort of, I guess the most important section, which is 26. I think they do bear out Conant's reading, Conant's claim, actually pretty clearly. But Kant goes off on some pretty complicated bylines before he gets there. So let's delve into that in the next two videos.